All right, day 6, reading the Power Broker, currently in part 5, Love of Power. Started chapter 27, the warp on the loom. Only got through 5 pages, pages 615 through 619. We're getting into public authority, so still just trying to really internalize what a public authority is, the significance of the public authority, so I have foundational understanding to be able to appreciate how Moses leveraged this tool to consolidate so much power. Because what I'm starting to understand is that it was, as the title of the chapter foreshadows, the warp on the loom, an analogy which I did not understand until having to look up every individual word, basically, which is what takes me so long to read. But that's okay, because, read slow and learn slow, but don't forget, that's what I'm trying to do here. The warp on a loom, if a loom is a mechanism to weave cloth, the warp is the stiff, in place, structure that you weave between. So it's the infrastructure that you use to weave the thread through to then create the cloth. My understanding of the analogy that Caro is drawing is the public authorities were the warps on the loom. Yesterday I was trying to learn about the public authorities too, to really kind of understand what they were. I think I have a little bit of a better understanding of what they are now. And this might be a little bit rough, but they're essentially kind of government created corporations, originally created to have a kind of autonomy that would enable them to more speedily create public works like roads or bridges or ports. And baked into the infrastructure of these public authorities was the ability to float bonds, so sell bonds to investors, which would finance the creation of the public works. And my understanding of what public authorities used to look like versus what Moses building on some of the financial innovations of Henry Cohen, who was, I guess, legal counsel for Julius Henry Cohen, who was general counsel for the Port Authority in New York, created, was that instead of a public authority being this corporation, government created corporation or creature thing that was created with the singular goal of creating one public work that would be financed by the bonds floated by the public authority, and then the public authority would cease to exist once the bonds were paid off, plus the interest on the bonds. So like a public authority would be created to say, create a bridge. Okay, so the government, would create this corporation to be like, okay, go do what you need to do in order to be able to create this bridge. You have the authority to issue bonds to finance the bridge. You can pitch them to whoever. Once the bridge is paid for and the tolls on that bridge have earned enough to pay back the bonds plus the interest, then the public authority will cease to exist. It will dissolve. This guy, Julius Henry Cohen, came up with the idea to essentially make the public authority itself an umbrella or a basket of public projects. So instead of a public authority being for like one bridge, it was like, well, let the public authority be the overarching, corporation that oversees multiple projects, so that the risk to the bondholders is thus diversified across those projects. So instead of the success of one bridge in being able to generate enough income to pay back the bonds, it would be dependent on the success of any of the public works within the public authority. So like a bridge, another bridge, a road, any other type of work or project that needed upfront financing but was promising to generate income in the future and be, the term Moses uses, self-liquidating, meaning having the capacity to earn money to be able to pay for itself, essentially. So a bridge with tolls, in theory, once built, so long as there's consistent traffic, will have the capacity to earn money to pay for its own construction over time, and then some, which is the interest that, bond buyers were interested in earning. So the machination and the idea behind a new version of a public authority was for it to be a basket of public works. So it would be more appealing to investors because their risk was diversified across multiple projects rather than the success of just one, which made it more enticing to investors, which made them more willing to be able to front the money to create the projects, house under the public authority. So reading about this, it feels strange to me that it wasn't immediately apparent earlier to diversify the risk, but I guess this is kind of the evolution of finances, diversification. The first parallel I felt come to mind was with mortgage-backed securities. Again, as I'm a complete tyro in the mechanics of government and I'm trying to become more knowledgeable through reading this, I am also a complete tyro in the mechanics of finance, but my understanding of what a mortgage-backed security was a tool to diversify risk. If a bank takes a risk when they lend, when they give out a mortgage, and they want to pass off that risk to an investor would be more excited to buy a security that represents thousands of mortgages because they're getting paid back and earning on those mortgages. A diversified bundle of them is higher than if they're relying on just one. And so those became attractive financial instruments because they allowed for the diversification of risk. Obviously, there are issues inherent in that as well, because if everything fails, then there's still risk, but in theory, diversification lowers overall risk. And so the public authority, in shifting from being a device to have one project come into becoming a device that oversees multiple, and as I'm coming to see, indefinite projects being overseen to come into being, that was more enticing for those entities that were going to put the money up front to create those projects. And the mechanics behind this stuff feels like turgid and kind of difficult to understand. I mean, I've read 5 pages and I've had to stop to really research a lot of the elements within these pages, namely, public authorities, even bonds, understanding the terms of bonds or how bonds really work, what a coverage ratio is, what floated even means, and to understand the elements of finance that became the tools that Robert Moses used to grow and consolidate power. And I think that I'm not so off in saying that once you get to the elements of these words, the essentials, they are easy to understand, but the complexity compounds if you're not able to break them down to their base elements. And this complexity confounded even the people at the time, namely the legislatures that allowed for Robert Moses to write laws that enabled him to be the overseer of these new versions of public authorities that had the power to, create indefinite projects and indefinitely issue bonds to fund those projects. And so, in the same way that he became more knowledgeable about the laws of government than many of the legislatures themselves, him doing the same thing with understanding elements of finance and then baking it into laws that he proposed and got passed in the legislature to empower him to have control over the financing of these projects, is what propelled him to power. And so, the lesson that I'm drawing from this is within complexity, where there are areas of misunderstanding, there's opportunity for exploitation, and Robert Moses exploited those opportunities. And it was his capacity to understand the mechanics of things deeply, legally, and then financially, that enabled him to seize a disproportionate amount of power within the framework of government at the time. And I think I'm starting to grasp this, and I think I'm starting to internalize the mechanics of how he came to power. But yeah, trying to step back and realize what there is to be learned here, that seems to be a lesson that's floating to the surface, is he understood the elements of government better than those representatives of government understood them themselves. And so he was able to exploit them to his own benefit. And extracted from that, I guess I would hope that in reading books like this, in understanding the mechanics of the world, one might be better positioned to exploit inefficiencies or exploit, elements of our reality to one's own gain. And obviously that's a gigantic thesis to be drawn from this, but in distilling what I'm learning here, it feels like a lesson that comes up time and again. Robert Moses is constantly learning, constantly changing, adapting, and we're seeing it even now in this. He used to think of public authorities the same way that everyone else thought of public authorities, which was tools to create one project, to get financing for one project, to have the autonomy of like essentially independently operating corporation to create that one project and then for it to dissolve. But because he had what Robert Moses outlines as a very supple mind, a mind capable of growing and of changing, he was able to step outside the bounds of and the limits of what people imagined possible and create a new framework. I guess there's a lesson there. Cultivate a supple mind. Understand things deeply so that you can appreciate how you might expand on how they could be different. And Robert Moses did that initially to a noble end, to bring his dreams into reality. But as we're seeing more and more, he put that powerful mind to use to the end of just accumulating power for power's sake. But still, he did so in part by maintaining a flexible mind, a supple mind, a mind capable of seeing possibilities where others didn't see them. And this element of his character is one worth striving to emulate. So in the spirit of that, I'm sitting here taking an hour to really try to understand 4 pages, 5 pages, understand the elements of these tools so that hopefully my mind is more supple to extract the lessons buried in this book and apply them to some extent in my own life. And my hope is that I can to some extent help you do that too through the lessons that I'm trying to derive from this master work. So, yep, reading slow, learning slower, but hopefully learning deeply, trying to learn deeply, and we'll catch you on the next page.